The monarch
Something
convulsed
is
on the highest
terribly
step,
wrong.
a rope biting into his wrists while thin. Dark foam flecked his lips, and priests struck the metal cymbals until the sound scraped the air. Suspicion tightened in the researcher's jaw the way a hand tightens on a book. He watched the chords, the priestly gestures, and counted props rather than miracles. He moved through the press of bodies with a scholar's caution and a watchman's hunger. Within 5 breaths, he had a rigid plan. Record what looked staged, mark what did not, and take proof of any instruction scribbled into temple margins. That suspicion pushed his feet forward when the crowd pushed back. The procession had begun at dusk and would end in terror. The researcher kept to the rear for survival and for observation. He had come to Sumer to catalogue rituals and to test the claim that kings became gods through theta. Now he watched a monarch named Namu Thrash bark orders that were caught and reissued by priests and force the city into a rhythm of fear. The problem was simple and brutal. The spectacle of possession sustained the law. If the spectacle failed, the law risked collapse. A priest shoved a brazier forward, and the flames licked the monarch's bare chest. The crowd recoiled. Kuda, a magistrate called from the front, speak the decree. Kuda, the researcher noted, then moved closer. The opening minutes contained 3 shocks. The monarch convulsed, the magistrate proclaimed sanctity, and a child vomited on the marble steps. Each item redirected the crowd's attention. The researcher wrote rapid notes on a scrap of leather. Cords, smoke, blow marks under the robe, bowls of bitter herbs, eyes of the guards. He felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion narrowing into focused curiosity as he catalogued the tools of terror. When the procession slid down the ziggurat and into the lamp-lit streets, the researcher watched the staging in detail. Torchbearers formed a star around the monarch to cast faces into hard shadow. Magistrates repeated refrains about the king's divinity. Men in plain cloth moved through the crowd and planted themselves near influential families. The researcher saw the planted guards place fingers on concealed daggers, and the way one priest kept a hand hidden in his sleeve. He noted the props again. Small iron hooks beneath the monarch's tunic, a flap of painted hide under his jaw. He smelled soot, boiled barley, and the metallic tang of burned copper. A woman in the crowd pointed. Namu!" she cried. Silence, the magistrate Kuda snapped. The researcher felt a second emotion shift. Curiosity sliding into unease as he realized the number of actors in the spectacle. He drew closer to a magistrate's retinue and saw the magistrate Kuda take a folded clay slip from the high priestess Mubelit. Mubelit's fingers were stained with ochre. She did not hide the exchange, but both men kept their expressions blank. The researcher understood that the stage ran offstage instructions. Later, under the forced quiet of a back alley, a scribe named Escher ducked toward the researcher and whispered, "You saw it." Escher, the researcher, answered, "Speak plainly." Escher's hands trembled. The tablets, they show the sequence, the herbs, the gestures, they write the crowd's cries. They moved toward the temple archive, while the city remained unaware of the question the researcher intended to force into light. Were these rites purely theta, or did ritual open something neither kings nor priests could fully control? That question settled into the researcher's method. He had to test the margins between simulation and actual possession. The temple archive smelled of damp clay and old oil. Shelves sagged with tablets covered in lines of cuneiform. The researcher introduced himself in the only way he knew how, by pointing at a tablet and reading aloud. He read the marginal notations that a trembling scribe had left centuries before, small scrolls that outlined timing, a preventative herb, and a passage that demanded the use of sterile smoke. Escher translated, "It instructs to stage a fit on the summit every month, Escher. It names the words to force a crowd to fear. Does it mention a horn?" The researcher asked. Escher's brow knitted. "A horn, yes. But also a warning." "What warning?" Escher tapped the clay. His finger left a smear of dust. "If a hidden voice answers, stop the rite and blame a servant." The researcher felt a third emotion shift then. unease pushing into alarm. He had anticipated stagecraft, but the tablet's warning hinted at an event outside stage directions, the possibility of an answering force. He made a choice he had not planned 3 hours earlier. He would not only catalogue the rite, he would watch the next public performance from a place where he could see both actors and mechanism. He bribed an apprentice scribe for a place in the upper gallery the next night. The gallery was a thin ledge where the city's most powerful watched. From there he could see the priest's hands at close range. He took his seat with a Shah and a reticent ex-priest who had once signed his name in the archive as Nabu. Nabu's face had the lines of someone who had knelt and then left a temple. He exhaled when the torches flared. Nabu kept his voice low. They trained Namu to fight at set beats, he said. They trained the crowd to cry at set words. Why did you leave? The researcher asked. Nabu's fingers tightened on the edge of his cloak. Because I saw how we lied with the dead. Their conversation was short and jagged. It produced facts, not catharsis. Nabu named the faction that controlled both rites and magistrates. He called them the custodians. He used 3 lines. Custodians pick the king. Custodians stage the proof. Custodians keep the city. The researcher wrote each line. The second external event arrived as the gallery fell into controlled silence. The priests began the chant and called the name of a god the crowd had long feared. The monarch began the same convulsions as earlier. The researcher watched the priests perform an insert. A priest at the monarch's shoulders slipped a small, raw cloth to his lips. The monarch gasped and made a sound like a broken bell. The crowd surged forward and pressed their faces to the rail. The researcher could see the hooks beneath the monarch's tunic. He could see the wet sheen on the priest's hands. He also saw something else, someone in the lower aisle not moving with the rhythm. Someone whose eyes were fixed on the monarch as though they were pulling a line. At the end of the chant, the magistrate Kuda stepped forward to proclaim, "By the sign of the god, the king speaks." Someone in the crowd, an old woman, began to sob in a way that wasn't part of the script. Her sobs grew into screams. A man shoved forward and hiccuped blood. The puppetry faltered for a second. Afterward, in the raw aftermath, the researcher followed the monarch's retinue to the palace gate. The monarch's breathing was ragged. A priest, Mubalit, murmured to Kuda in a tone the researcher had learned to read as command. "Create a scapegoat," she said. Kuda's face had no expression. "Do it," he said. The researcher watched a serving boy stumble out into the courtyard, pushed forward by 2 guards. He confessed. One guard lied to the crowd. He admits he poisoned the god. The crowd seized on the lie like a rope. The researcher swallowed and felt anger replace a prior fear. He had seen the system at work: stage terror, public reinforcement, immediate scapegoating. The city's governance moved by performance. The researcher decided to get the records that produced those lies. He broke into the back of the archive with a Shah's help that same night. They moved with wool-clad feet, lanterns clipped low to avoid attention, and hands that knew where clay dust feigned footprints. In a corner they found a tablet different from the rest. The inscription was not a liturgy but an instruction manual. Timing marks, lists of names, notes in a different hand about private demonstrations. The hand belonged to a high priestess, clerk. The tablet named Mubalit and a magistrate. It described how to induce feints in private so the magistrate could see how far the monarch could be pushed. Eshar whispered, "This is the proof." A sound at the door made them freeze. Footsteps, too. The researcher tightened his grip on the tablet and shoved it inside his coat. He motioned Eshar back into the shadows. They did not speak. Footsteps passed by the archive door and moved away. A small external event. A patrol passed and did not search the archive. The researcher exhaled and felt a new emotion. Grim resolve. The discovery had shifted the problem from theoretical to actionable. If they could show leaders and magistrates colluding in ritual theater, they could undermine the custodians. But a second twist waited. 2 nights later, the researchers sneaked into a private palace antechamber with Eshar. The windows were shuttered. A brazier spit orange sparks. Inside, the high priestess Mubalit arranged smoking bowls and set a mask upon a table. The magistrate Kuda took a seat. The monarch lay on cushions. The researcher watched through a slit in the tapestry. Mubalit picked up the mask and brushed across its inside with a streak of ochre. She smiled without warmth. "Kuda," she said, "watch how he breaks." Kuda did not answer. He watched the monarch. Mubalit dipped a finger into a bowl and touched the monarch's tongue. He convulsed in a pattern the researcher already knew. Then Mubalit whispered a second incantation into his ear, words that did not appear in the public tablet, but matched a marginal note on the stolen slab. She pulled the mask over the monarch's face. He thrashed but then stilled, as if someone tightened a strap on his chest from inside. The private demonstration ended with the magistrate nodding. The researcher slipped back into the corridor with Eshar and Nabu and exchanged lines quickly. "Nabu," the researcher hissed, "did you see a mask?" "Yes, Nabu." "And herbs for numbness." "Eshar, the tablet." "Taken." "Eshar." Their rapid exchange reflected escalating stakes. Nabu added, "They practice making the king a thing people fear and then control that fear." The researcher felt clarity harden like cooled lava. The ritual was engineered, but the engineers used words that sometimes held power beyond their intention. The warning on the tablet now looked like preface to a danger. If the staged rite ever met a hidden ritualist with a different intent, the result could be real possession. The mid-chapter cliffhanger occurred before dawn, when they discovered a second inscription tucked inside the mask's lining. Tiny cuneiform scratched into the leather. A petition to an entity named Ashu and a single note. Answered once, the researcher folded the scrap and hid it inside his grimoire. Days later, the public rite on the temple dais became the pivot of everything. The crowd gathered and chanted the lines the magistrate insisted upon. The researcher had a vantage that showed both the priest's hands and the backstage corridors. He watched as Mubalit signaled a hidden guard with a motion of her brow. A figure in plain clothes pushed through the crowd and up the temple aisle. The researcher recognized the motion that had not been rehearsed. The hidden cultist Ashu stepped into the ritual's ark and shouted a word the researcher had only seen scratched inside the mask. The sound was low and precise. The monarch's eyes rolled, but this time the convulsions did not follow the previously rehearsed rhythm. His hands ripped at the bindings. The priests tried the standard holds. Ropes tore. Mubalit's face went pale. She moved to calm him and her hands trembled. The monarch sprang up and struck a priest. He screamed a name not in any liturgy. The priest's throat flooded with blood. The researcher saw the crowd's bite change from fear to panic. Stones flew. Guards drew blades. The ritual that had been a script became an eruption of movement and violence. The hidden cultist moved with a calm that did not belong to the rest of them. When the researchers tried to step forward, a guard pointed a spear at them and said, "Back." In the chaos, the magistrate Kuda attempted damage control. He shouted a proclamation, attempted to scapegoat a servant, and then saw the monarch rip his mask and throw it to the ground. The researcher saw where the mask landed. By the foot of a servant who had been present in the private demonstration. The servant looked at the mask, then at the monarch, and did not speak. The crowd's fear shifted into anger. Someone yelled, "Witch!" Nabu lunged toward the dais and pulled a small tablet from his robe.
He shouted, "They manufactured this!"
Who manufactured it? Kuda demanded.
"Nabu!"
The researcher called. Nabu says the custodians scripted the fits. Nabu held the tablet up. The guards seized him. The hidden cultist spoke one more word calmly and then ran toward the shadowed stair. The monarch convulsed into silence and then dropped like a sack. The crowd moved like water over rock. Some fled. Some pushed closer to drag an accused man forward. The researcher seized the opportunity. He took the tablet Nabu had raised and ran. They chased him. A guard slashed his sleeve. Escher threw a stool to slow the pursuers. The researcher felt his heart beat in a pattern that matched the city's drums. He tucked the tablet inside his coat and dove through a narrow side gate. They lost 2 pursuers in the press. The external event of a chase occurred every 10 breaths. The researcher forced his breath into short, controlled pulls. He felt fear now, not curiosity. That fear sharpened action. Hide the evidence, find a safe hand to copy it, and reveal it where it would matter. They reached a tavern backroom where Nabu had agreed to meet them if trouble began. Nabu was not there. The researcher banged on the table and hissed, "Nabu!" From the doorway, Nabu limped in with a gash on his scalp. His robe was torn. "They beat me," he said. "They the magistrate I tried to burn the holy scrolls." "Who?" Escher demanded. "Guards, Nabu and Mubalit's men." "Why did you show the tablet?" Kuda's voice came from the doorway as 2 guards re-entered. Kuda's face had an odd lean now, an expression the researcher could only read as calculation. "Because the people must know Nabu." "Silence, Kuda," and he swore an oath that made people flinch. They argued for a handful of heated lines. The researcher and Nabu exchanged rapid lines no longer than a breath each while Escher tried to bind Nabu's wound. The argument produced a decision. The researcher would leave with the tablet and find a scribe in the outer quarter to copy its content. Nabu would remain and attempt to hold the room. Escher pressed a small vial into the researcher's hand. "Take it," he said. "If they stop you, burn the tablet. Promise." The researcher felt a last emotional shift. Alarm curdled into grim determination. He did not promise words. He nodded and left by a side street where dawn blood pale over mud and tile. At the final dawn reckoning, the researcher and Escher met in a dilapidated study, candles guttered. Escher set a tray of ink and reed pens across the table. He unrolled the tablet and began to copy. The researcher watched the lines emerge on fresh clay and felt the system's engine laid bare, names, methods, lists of herbs and masks, and the single scratched entry that made him pause. If a voice answers, respond with blame. If violence breaks, blame the servant next to it. Someone had scrawled a marginal line in a different hand. Once answered, "Ashu," the researcher turned the clay so the light licked the tiny scratches. "Escher," the researcher said quietly. "Who is Ashu?" Escher looked at the line and then at the researcher. "A name used in old petitions," he said. "Some say a spirit. Some say a secret name for a faction." Nabu's earlier confession folded into the present. The researcher thought of Mubalit's mask, of the magistrate's quiet nod, of the hidden cultist's calm cry. He felt the emotion root, suspicion loom again, but now the suspicion arrived as evidence, shaped resolve. He pressed his fingers against the clay and felt its chill. He had proof the rites were staged and dangerous. He had proof that a private line, Ashu, linked to a moment when the staged rite had turned truly violent. That connection changed the whole claim, that the monarch's possession was purely performance. Escher paused and then said, "If we publish this, the custodians will move to silence anyone who speaks." "We publish carefully," the researcher answered. "We copy, we hide, we spread to houses beyond the city. We make the records public where magistrates cannot erase them." Escher's hands shook, but he continued to copy. Outside, a cart clattered by and a dog barked. The city had resumed small noises. Inside, the clay bore names that would not vanish easily. They finished as the sun rose higher and bled light into the room. The researcher wrapped the copied lines in oilcloth. He felt the weight of an immediate choice. Flee now with the copies, or attempt to return to Nabu and help resist the custodians at a local level. He thought of Nabu's wound and of the way the crowd had turned on a servant in the square. He thought of Mubalit's unblinking smile. He thought of the hidden words scratched inside the mask. He made the practical decision. He slid the oilcloth under his coat, fastened the grimoire at his hip, and checked the brass pendant at his throat, by touch more than by sight. The pendant's edge was worn from fingers. He had used it once to open a locked drawer in the archive. Now it held a new meaning. A reminder to keep moving, Ishar stood and pushed a reed pen into the researcher's hand. "Go to the scribe by the western gate," he said. "Tell him to copy 3 sets and bury one in the river bank under the south bridge." Ishar, the researcher, said, "I will come back for Nabu." Nabu's voice came from the corridor then, low and ragged. "Do not trust the magistrate Kuda," he said. "Do not trust Mubalit. They will call me traitor. Who else knows?" The researcher asked. "Not enough, Nabu." The researcher left through a side door where the dawn smelled of warm barley and wet stone. He kept the clay close to his chest. He felt each step as a decision made visible. Behind him, the city breathed. A sequence of market calls, a bell, the clatter of a cart. Ahead, the researcher walked toward the western gate. He had begun the day with suspicion, moved through curiosity and alarm, and ended with resolved action. He did not know whether the ritual's veneer would hold or shatter across the wider world. He did know one concrete thing. In his coat, the tablet would either topple an order or become kindling. He would take that risk. He walked into the market with Ishar at his shoulder and a scribe waiting by the gate. A cart wheel squealed. A dog nosed a scrap of bread. The researcher looked up at the distant silhouette of the ziggurat and tightened his grip on the clay. He set his jaw and moved toward the scribe, carrying evidence that could redistribute power by ink and by rumor. The chapter closed with a sound, a knock at the tavern door down the lane, timed and deliberate, that made both men look toward the alley and pause. The monarch jerked awake on a pallet, foam at his mouth and rope abrasions on his wrists, and suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw. The royal physician held a pressed cloth to the king's temple, while Chief Priestess Ninsara shoved bitter herbs between the sovereign's teeth. "Lugal, Kala," the physician said, breathing shallow with the effort. "Ilu, Medu says he will not speak clearly yet." The priestess cut the air with her hand. "Keep him quiet." The plaza needs the proof. Within those first moments, the problem stood bare. The city's legitimacy depended on a public display of divine possession, and the monarch's body was failing the performance. The researcher moved closer to the pallet to examine the king's blistered wrists and the thin, dark foam. He counted the bruises along the forearms, the pattern of a rope loop, and found a bruise at the base of the skull that the physician's gloved fingers avoided. Suspicion drove his fingers to the hem of the royal blanket. He found a smear of ochre there, and a folded scrap of linen sewn with a small clay shard. The researcher had seen the monarch convulse on the ziggurat in the summit ritual. He had watched the rope bite into flesh, and priests strike cymbals until the sound scraped the air. That scene waited under his lid like a recorded image. He set the memory aside and asked, "Who touched this shard last?" He the question aloud because spoken questions drew answers here. Chief Priestess Ninsara looked at the researcher with lips pressed, eyes steady, then at Ilu Medu. The attendants moved him after the dawn, after the rite. "You know this," her voice did not soften. The physician answered, "We moved him when he stopped breathing from the exertion." The crown cannot lose its proof. The researcher reached for the shard and felt cold clay grit under his fingertips. He tasted the hospital air, iron from the brazier mire smoke, a metallic tang from the cloth on the king's brow, and considered a question he had not yet voiced to the assembled temple staff. Was this possession a divine interruption or an engineered collapse? The thought was not speculative. It guided every step he would take that night. He turned the shard so the candlelight struck one edge and rid a row of cuneiform incisions. The priesting staff tensed. "Give that here, Enlil," Zu demanded from the corridor entrance. The researcher stepped back, keeping the shard hidden on his palm. "You will not," he began. Enlil, Zu interrupted with a single hard sentence. "You will hand it over, researcher. We will not tolerate blasphemy in the infirmary." The physician moved to back the priest. The researcher let his hesitation show for a beat, then asked the physician directly, "Ilu Medu, did you see a perforated lining on the king's scalp?" Ilu Medu looked at the king's neck and then away. "There is a red place. I cauterized a seam." We do what keeps him alive and the city calm. The conversation tightened into accusation. The researcher kept the shard against his palm as he heard a thread of panic in the chamber's outer corridor. The guard captain had ordered a watch at the ziggurat's steps. That movement meant the priests intended to escalate the spectacle. The researcher felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion curdled into doubt about the limits of the temple's honesty. He left the infirmary under the pretense of consulting records. In the corridor, by a brazier that burned with resin, he cornered a temple scribe he had met weeks earlier. Aresh's hands shook when the researcher touched his wrist. Aresh, the researcher, I need access to the archive tonight. Aresh swallowed. You should not be asking me. Enlil Zu will never open that vault for anyone but himself, the researcher replied. Then you will help me, or I will report your negligence to the crown. Aresh's jaw worked. He nodded. The researcher's use of pressure was a measured, practical tactic. He chose leverage the way a physician chooses a wound to probe. They moved through the temple's inner corridor, where the walls still held fresher soot from incense. The researcher kept the shard sewn into his palm and watched the way the guard's boots scuffed the stone. He was alert for the second emotion shift, doubt sliding into a cold fear as the implications broadened. If the possession could be induced, then the mechanism of rule itself was a theatrical construction. That knowledge would destroy more than the high priest standing. They entered the archive at a point where the scribe could bypass the main door with a small iron key. The vault smelled of damp clay tablets, and the air felt sticky where candle wax pooled. Aresh worked with clumsy haste to open the chest that held the damp tablets. He moved fingers over clay like he was reading a forbidden letter. The researcher's eyes flicked to a sealed crate stamped with Ninsara's mark. Aresh lifted a damp tablet that had been wrapped in linen. This one was taken from a newly buried offering. He whispered. They meet to place it atop the shelf and forget it. The researcher set the shard on the table beside the tablet and laid a palm over it to steady the clay. He brushed aside the linen and read an incantation written in a small, neat hand. The tablet listed bitter resins, perforation points for the scalp, and a sequence of struck symbols and breath control that matched the rhythm the researcher had recorded at the ziggurat. The cleric's notes included a measure of dosage and a ritual stage marked public spectacle. He read the specific line that sat like a key, an instruction to administer a paste of resins and then to strike the king's head rhythmically at precise intervals while attendants loosened ties. It was an engineering of trance. The researcher felt the third emotion shift. Fear shifted to clarity about the scale of manipulation. This was not an isolated trick. This ritualized artifice had been written and preserved. Aresh whispered. Ninsara wrote this. She compiled it with Enlil Zu. They signed a mark beneath the text. He produced a damp smear of finger, ink in the margin that matched Ninsara's known seal. They wanted the palace confident. They wrote how to make the gods appear. The researcher held the tablet and the shard together, mapping scratches and notches. A new plan formed. He would confront the high priestess and Enlil Zu with the tablet in the inner hall during the small morning audience, when attendants gathered news for the plaza. The timing was surgical. Before the grand enthronement, before gossip could be controlled, he threaded a message to a trusted attendant to call for a meeting. The page, an anxious temple attendant, arrived breathless at dawn. The high priest and Ninsara will be in the inner hall at first light, the attendant said. They spoke of the enthronement. Bring Aresh, the researcher, bring the tablet. Do not let the guard captain know. They entered the inner hall with the tablet wrapped in linen and the shard hidden in the researcher's cloak. The hall smelled of oil and wax. A brazier in the center threw light against low frescoes of past kings receiving crowns. Enlil Zu and Ninsara sat on opposing benches. Their postures showed control. Guard Captain Uru stood near the entrance like a stone figure. The crown prince watched from a shadowed doorway, Enlil, Zu, the researcher, placing the linen bundle on the table. I wish to ask about the ancestral rites, Enlil. Zu's hand lifted. We will speak in the temple's proper time. You show disrespect by... Ninsara cut him off. Show the tablet. Let it be seen for what it is. She walked forward quickly, and the room's rhythm shifted. Aresh unfolded the tablet. The clay dust clouded the air. Ninsara's face flattened in a way the researcher had not seen before. Enlil, Zu reached for it with slow hands and then recoiled. Blasphemy. Enlil, Zu said finally, voice low and with the practiced cadence of accusation. This was never used in our rites. He looked sharply at the attendant who had delivered the researcher. The guard captain moved as if to seize Aresh. The researcher stepped between them. You will not take him. I have the right to question temple records. He kept his voice low but steady. Uru's knuckles tightened on his spear. You are a troublemaker, researcher. The city needs the king to be whole. This scribe has endangered that. A cluster of rapid dialogue followed, 3 to 6 exchanges in quick succession, where accusations and denials collided. You forged this. Ninsara snapped at Aresh. You buried it. The researcher, why hide instruction on induced trance if it is not used? Silence. Enlil, Zu slammed a palm on the table. You speak of gods and right of sedition. We wrote them to be safeguards. Ninsara, low and sharp. To preserve the city when chaos knocked. Safeguards that teach how to fake a god. The researcher returned. The guard captain moved forward. Aresh began to tremble. The hall's temperature tightened with human breath and authority. The researcher felt a concrete shift. The deliberate assault on the priest's monopoly forced immediate choices among men who wielded power. The dispute did not resolve in words. Uru seized the scribe's wrist and barked, You will come with me. Now Aresh tried to pull back and lost his footing. The researcher grabbed Uru's wrist. A short, hard struggle ensued. Ninsara's voice rose into a command to her acolytes. Hands found the scribe. Someone struck a torch against a brazier and oil spat. The physical scuffle scattered wax and clay across the hall. The researcher found himself shoved back against a fresco, breath knocking against his ribs. He heard the crown prince announce nothing but watchful silence from his doorway. The researcher had aimed to expose the tablet and force a reckoning. Instead, the priests used the moment to brand the artifact as blasphemy and to move quickly against his ally. The researcher's reaction was immediate. He slipped the clean shard from where he had hidden it and pressed it into his palm, then slid it inside his coat. The next event came quicker than any of them expected. The temple sent runners to the plaza where the morning ceremony waited. Word spread like an added notch on a tally. The researcher was led away to a small guard cell beneath the palace, hands bound but not cruelly. The scribe was taken the same way. The crown prince watched the exit with a thin, unreadable expression. In the cell the stone smelled of damp and iron. The researcher sat on a slab and worked his wrists free enough to move his fingers. He cleaned the shard on his sleeve until the cuneiform read clear. He read aloud, using a soft voice not to attract the guard. The incantation's meter, the breathing technique, the exact order for symbol strikes. He mapped the ritual to the earlier memory of the Ziggurat's summit. Identical rhythms, the same foam at the king's mouth, the same scald at the base of the skull. A guard opened the hatch to pass bread and paused when he noticed the researcher moving. Uru says you are dangerous, the guard said, but kept his hand steady. He left with a long, noticeable glance. The researcher traced the clay letters using the nail of his thumb, turning the shard like a compass. He deciphered a fragment that pointed beyond the temple. A notation about foreign resins and a trader's mark. The notation was not local. Someone, some outside cult or traveling practitioner, had supplied the technique. That single line altered the map of culpability. It meant the ritual was not merely an in-house trick but part of a network, an industry of induced godhood. He wrapped the shard carefully and hid it within a seam he could reach with a finger. He had accomplished exposure and paid for it. The city's priests had silenced the immediate threat by arrest, but the researcher had taken an object that contained proof of engineering and an address that widened the conspiracy. He sat with a quiet, practical resolve. The fear had become a plan. Word of the day's violence spread through the palace like a second messenger. The crown prince slipped away from his doorway, and rumors of factional meetings multiplied. In Lille, Zhu decreed curfew and confiscated the temple registers. Guards made rounds at market stalls. The researcher listened to shoe leather pass along the corridor above his head and counted the cadence until it matched the rhythm written on the tablet. Recollection and evidence had become tools he could use. He felt an internal change. The clarity he had found hardened into resolve to find the foreign mark named in the tablet. That night, lamps guttered in the guard halls, and the monarch's distant chanting traveled through stone. The researcher held the tablet fragment to the slit of the cell's hatch and read a single cipher aloud. He tasted blood at the corner of his mouth, not his, but the memory of the plaza's chaos, and he catalogued the names he would need next. Areshi's frightened face, Ninsara's precise hands, in Lille, Zhu's practiced cadence, Yuru's blunt justice, and the crown prince's silent watch. He thought of the summit of the ziggurat, where the monarch had convulsed and where priests had struck cymbals until the sound scraped the air. That scene had been both hook and evidence. It had led him here. He felt two clear emotion shifts across the chapter. Suspicion moved to doubt, then to fear and clarity, and finally to cold resolve expressed through action. At last, alone, he cleaned the shard's edge with his sleeve and decoded one last word. A merchant's sigil he had seen once at a coastal bazaar months ago. It was a name he could follow. He folded the tablet fragment into his robe, where the seam would hide it from cursory searchers. He felt the cell's stone against his back, and a pressing awareness that the next steps would require safer allies and sharper deceit. A guard's footstep returned to the hatch. The researcher pressed the shard under the hem of his sleeve, where it would not show until he chose to reveal it. He ran his thumb along the shard's edge to make sure the letters would not flake. He straightened, and as the key turned outside, he tightened his mouth and rehearsed the next lie he would tell the crown prince, knowing the prince might be the one person to harbor the map he required. Outside, the city prepared for a ritual meant to reassert authority. Inside, the temple had split into factions ready to seize advantage. The researcher had lost immediate freedom, but had carried evidence into darkness. He had forced the priests to show their hand and paid for it with a cell. He had gained a direction to follow. He heard the key begin to turn in the lock. He slid the cleaned shard beneath his sleeve as footsteps neared and a key turned in the outer lock. The monarch convulsed on the throne. A rope creaked against carved wood, and the crowd recoiled as cymbals hit a steady, metallic scrape. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw within that first heartbeat. He moved forward because doubt demanded proof rather than pity. The plaza smelled of sweat and tallow. Voices turned into a single high keening when the sovereign's hands clawed at his robe. The central problem could not be postponed. A coronation made to confirm divine rule had become public evidence of collapse. The occult researcher had not planned to intervene. He watched from the edge of the crowd, fingers curled against the leather of his grimoire, half-moon spectacles catching the sun. He remembered the summit, how the king had once foamed at the mouth on ziggurat stone, and he remembered the pallet where the monarch had awakened with rope abrasions. Both memories were concrete, the rope marks, the pressed cloth at a temple bedside. Those images tightened his suspicion and moved him forward through the press of bodies. "Get him down," a noble shouted. "Carry him inside." High Vizier Enika stepped onto the dais and barked orders. The researcher threaded between a woman with an embroidered veil and a child clutching a brass coin, keeping his eyes on the monarch's chest rise and fall. The monarch's shoulders jerked like a man trying to shrug off sleep, then convulsed again with a ragged sound that scattered the ceremonial chant. The crowd broke into murmurs, and some who had come to witness blessing now watched with eyes that had an edge to them. Chief Priestess Ninsara pushed through the priests, robes sweeping, and she planted herself at the monarch's head as if shaping the scene. "Ninsara," a guard hissed. "Restore order." Ninsara's lip curled. She laid one hand against the king's temple, and another against the ceremonial crown, as if steadying a fainting actor. The researcher felt his suspicion harden into a plan. He would follow. Priests seized the sovereign by elbows and dragged him under a curtained portal toward the inner days. The researcher moved with them, passing the high vizier whose face had gone pale, but not empty of calculation. The royal physician Lugal, color hovered behind, a pressed cloth in hand, and he kept glancing at the monarch's wrists. "Lugal, color," the researcher said under his breath, stepping close enough for the physician to see the leather book at his hip. The physician met his eyes and did not deny the wounds. The corridor smelled of boiled herbs and drenched linen. Curtains muffled the noises of the plaza, but the sound of distant footsteps and shouted names still leaked through. Enaka rounded on a cluster of nobles. "Calm the crowd," he ordered. "This will pass. This is the sign of the god returning." He the word God like a tool, not a prayer. Ninsara moved to the inner days and began the measured gestures of invocation, her fingers tapping a rhythm against a small bronze bowl. Behind the curtain, the tone shifted immediately from spectacle to private panic. Enaka slammed his palm against painted wood and demanded, "Ninsara, what is this?" Ninsara's reply was clipped. He faltered at the wrong moment. "We must complete the pattern, raise the band, bind the witness." Lugal, callous voice cut in. "Enaka, his pulse is shallow and irregular. The bruising on the wrists is real. He has been drugged and restrained." The researcher watched the exchange and felt clarity arrive. Political stakes rose faster than any prayer. Enaka fired back with the vocabulary of power. "Expose this now and the nobles will call for a regent. We lose allies. We lose tribute. Ninsara, do your work and make it look like the god took him." He leaned in toward the chief priestess. "Make it convincing. The crowd must leave with fear, not questions." Ninsara's mouth flattened, and she glanced at the curtain where an acolyte stood in shadow. The acolyte's eyes found the researcher. Mira, the acolyte who had tended lamp oil for months, slid from the shadow and pressed a folded clay tablet into the researcher's palm. He felt the tablet's rough edges, the faint smear of ochre on one edge. Mira's hand trembled when it released the tablet. "Take it," she whispered. It came from his robe. "I took it while they changed him." The researcher felt the first emotion shift, doubt collapsing into astonishment and urgency. He opened the tablet's shallow face with his thumb and traced the cuneiform with a fingertip. The lines were tight, functionary, not mystical, an instruction, a recipe. It named a compound of bitter seed and opiate root, a sequence for binding the mouth, and an incantation whose syllables were staged to prompt convulsion on cue. The tablet's final lines were not prayer. They were a ledger entry, a tally of payments to a named physician and a brass pendant's inventory number. He pressed the tablet to his chest and looked up at Mira. "Mira, how long have you watched?" he asked. Her voice was barely a breath. "A week," she said. "Longer. I baked the oil each dawn. I watched the king when he stirred." They handed him herbs through the handmaiden's cup. The researcher felt the second shift. Astonishment sliding into cold clarity and then into anger that tasted like iron at the gums. "Show me the pendant," he said. Mira produced a small brass pendant, dull with mud and sweat. Its engraving was simple, a sigil with 3 short hash marks. She had hidden it in the fold of her apron. "They use it to force him to obey," she said. Ninsara, the binding would stop the sovereign from waking when he wished to stop. Her eyes dropped away from his face. "If I do nothing, they'll seal him forever." Her confession laid another fact on the table. Someone in the priesthood wanted permanent possession. The researcher folded the tablet and slid it into his coat. He kept his voice low. Mira, you understand what you carry. We must decide whether to expose this now or secure proof first. Her fingers brushed his palm. Expose them, she breathed, if they can make him obey. They'll make the city obey. He felt a tremor in his hands but did not show it. Suspicion had become moral pressure. He could not stand aside. He confronted Eneka in a shadowed corridor. The vizier stepped back as if struck by a chill. The researcher slammed the tablet onto a shelf and let the clay clack. Eneka, he said, you have engineered the sovereign's possession. The vizier's jaw tightened. The court will hear nonsense from an outsider. He asked Eneka the tablet names the sedative and the pendant. Lugal, Kala will confirm the bruises. Ninsara will not be able to explain the tally of payments. The researcher watched the vizier's color drain. Anaka's voice turned to threat. Quick and low, you are careless. Guards will call this treason. Gatekeeper Aramu appeared at the corridor mouth and put a heavy hand on Eneka's shoulder. Eneka, will you have the scholar seized? Aramu, watching the researcher by the lamp. The vizier tried to bargain. No arrests yet. Bring me the pendant quietly. Hand it over and I will ensure the king receives treatment. The researcher heard the promise and the lie in the same syllable. Aramu, the researcher said, look at the tablet. You have been paid to guard the rituals. Does your ledger match this tablet? Aramu hesitated. The gatekeeper's face was a map of loyalty and fear. He did not answer quickly. At that hesitation, the researcher felt the second emotion shift complete. Clarity to alarm, then to a grim resolve to force the court's hand. Mira's confession returned like a bell. She crouched near a food store and whispered specifics. Nuns moving pots of bitter tea at dawn, a handmaiden's cup laced before the procession, a priest who had sold antidotes at a fixed price. Each detail added fuel to the researcher's case. He for Lugal, Kala by name, and the physician came with a face like a man who had seen too many dying in silence. Lugal, Kala, the researcher said. Did you prepare sedatives for the sovereign? The physician's hand tightened on the cloth he carried. I was asked to stabilize a king who suffered seizures. Lugal, Kala replied. They presented it as treatment. I found traces of soporifics in his serum. I sealed the report and gave it to Ninsara. He kept his voice flat. They paid well. The researcher felt the court's rot arrange into a readable pattern. Practical harm dressed as sacred theater. The inner sanctum swelled with argument. Eneka and Ninsara traded clipped orders. Ninsara insisted the possession must be sealed publicly to preserve the narrative. If we fail, the rivals will eat the throne and the river grain will be seized. Eneka. If we proceed and he dies, we still save the house. Choose Ninsara. Ninsara's response was measured. We will bind him and perform the blood sealing on the days tonight. Her hands moved to gather ceremonial cloth. The researcher stepped forward. You will not bind him, he said. This is not possession. It is coercion and chemical staging. The priests spun toward him. Who are you to interrupt the rites? A senior priest demanded. The researcher did not answer their insult. Instead, he lifted the clay tablet and showed the tali, the recipe, the pendant inventory. Several priests paled. Others hissed and took a step back. Ninsara's face hardened. You accuse us with a child's scrap, she said. You accuse me in front of the court. Her voice did not tremble. Eneka's hand slid to the hilt at his belt. Eneka, the researcher said. There are witnesses. Mira can testify. Lugal, Kala will confirm bruises and drug traces. Do you want to throw down the curtain here and now? The court's atmosphere snapped into danger. Guards tensed, swords shifted in their sheaths. A rapid exchange erupted between Eneka and the researcher, short, sharp lines that cut like flint. Eneka, this ends tonight, the researcher said. Eneka, we will hold the ceremony and arrest the guilty. You threaten my house, Eneka snapped. You expose yourself and your grimoire to ruin. The vizier. Eneka, we have proof. The researcher replied. Seize him, Eneka ordered. 3 guards moved. Before the guards could close, Mira stepped forward and called out, Stop! Her voice made a clear line through the corridor. Mira, what are you doing? Enocha demanded. She will speak. The researcher said, Mira, tell them how you found the pendant. Tell them about the cup. Mira looked at the monarch on the curtained dais and then to the faces around her. She spoke quickly, concrete and steady. I saw them give him bitter tea at dawn. I watched the handmaidens slip herbs. I took the pendant because I feared what they would do. I hide it now. If you bind him, he will not wake when he wants to. That confession shifted the room. It was the chapter Smid, cliffhanger, an immediate threat and an undeniable witness. At the dais, priests began the blood rite regardless. Ninsara lifted a blade while Enocha shouted for the performance to continue to preserve the narrative. Lugal, Collar pushed forward and seized the blade, hands steady. Stop this, Lugal, Collar said. If you pierce him now, you will kill him. The sedatives will not be reversed under blood code. He looked at Ninsara. Ninsara, back away. The priestess hesitated. The tension in the room stiffened into a single bright line. Guards surged and the scene disintegrated into shoves and choking curses. Anaker's supporters pulled toward the throne while others backed Ninsara. Aramu, the gatekeeper, found himself pushed into the center of the scuffle. He had a hand on a spear and another on a satchel of ledgers. His loyalty pivoted in a breath. The researcher felt his pulse beat loud in the rubbled silence between blows. He stepped into the push to reveal the pendant and the tablet himself. The blade rose. The researcher lunged and threw the clay tablet and pendant onto the ritual cloth, exposing them in the monarch's presence. Look, he said, look at what you have in your hands. This is ledger and lore, not godwork. Ninsara reached for the items. Aramu pushed between them and grabbed the pendant. His knuckles were white. Aramu, you are named on this ledger, the researcher said. Do you deny payments? Aramu's face folded. He let out a raw sound, and then he shoved the pendant into his own robe to hide it. The revelation turned the violence into chaos. Guards fought across the dais, and the monarch lay half covered, body torn by ropes, and half swaddled in ceremonial cloth. A priest struck a guard across the face with a censer. A noble tried to drag his cousin from the fray. The researcher grabbed Mira's arm and pulled her back from the edge of the fight. Mira, stay with me, he ordered. Mira, do not run. She nodded and kept her eyes on the pendant. When the pushing stopped, the monarch lay inert and breathing shallowly. Enocha reeled from a wound at his side and stumbled away, forcing his supporters to follow. Ninsara was bound at the wrists by temple laces and hauled to a bench. Lugal, Kala tended to the monarch's mouth, pressing cloth to lips and checking for pulse. He muttered the clinical terms aloud so the court would hear. Sedative residue high, respiratory depression. Reversal required. The court's narrative had ruptured. The aftermath was not loud. It was a tidy, surgical rearrangement of loyalties. The High Vizier fled with his private guard and a chest of scrolls. Ninsara was restrained and would later be questioned under oath by elders. Lugal, Kala remained by the sovereign and worked, hands moving with the steady motions of a physician who had mended more than one performance. Aramu cradled the pendant in his palm and would later reveal where he had hidden payments. The researcher watched each movement and noted the new alignments forming in the room. Night fell while the court whispered and counted losses. The researcher returned to his private study within the temple complex. The grated window opened to the cool smell of river mud. He cleared a small table, laid the tablet face up, and transcribed each line into his grimoire with a careful, deliberate hand. He copied the tally of payments, the sedative recipe, the names of those who supplied it. He traced the pendant's marks onto a fresh page and pinned a strip of the cloth from the monarch's robe beside it. Each stroke of ink made the case heavier and more difficult to dismiss. He did not sleep. He catalogued witnesses. Mira, who had smuggled the pendant. Lugal, Kala, who had confirmed chemical traces. Aramu, who had access to ledgers, and the nobles who had seen Enocha wound with blood. The researcher placed the original clay tablet into a sealed envelope and closed his grimoire. He felt a final emotion change. from urgency and exposure to a cautious calculation about the long reach of ritualized power. Before he left the study, he hid the brass pendant beneath a loose floorboard under his desk, slipped a pebble into the gap to seal it, and then set the grimoire onto the shelf where he kept his notes on incantations and staged rites. He locked the door from the inside and listened for footsteps beyond the corridor. The chapter ended on a physical act rather than a thought. He extinguished the oil lamp, slid the bolt, and folded the tablet inside his robe to carry evidence into the next confrontation. Outside, the city murmured with rumor. Inside, the researcher's hands smelled of ink, bitter seed, and spilled mire. He had turned suspicion into proof. He had forced the court to choose between burying the truth and facing its consequences. The next steps would require allies and planning. For now, he had copied the ledger, hidden the pendant, and left the study with the clay tablet pressed against his ribs like a sullen heart. The final sound before the door clicked shut was the distant, uneven breathing of a sovereign who might recover or might not. And that uncertainty would shape the court's next move. Suspicion burned in the researcher as he forced the stone trapdoor aside and dropped into the apothecary, breath sharp from the cold air. The room smelled of crushed herbs and iron. A clay jar sat open on a workbench with a paper tag that read for the ascension in a priestly hand. Ninsara straightened with a bowl in her hands and Lugal. Color froze over a tray of vials as the researcher stepped forward and said, "Stop." The three of them held their positions. The jar tipped and a dark smear of ochre ran along the workbench and into the carved grooves of the table. Within those first moments, the central problem became clear. The sovereign's seizures might be staged to seize and hold power, not signs of genuine possession. The researcher did not wait to be explained. He moved toward the jar, fingers trying to stay steady, and lifted a folded protocol from beneath the workbench with his other hand. The paper was brittle. The top line listed names, dates, and the phrase Ascension Protocol followed by step-by-step instructions. He read aloud, because reading aloud forced facts into the room like stones. Dose the king on the third night. Induce seizure with symbol shock. Place the sigil under tongue. Ninsara's face did not flicker. Lugal, Kala's hand trembled on a feel. The researcher felt the pull from suspicion into a second emotion. Doubt that would change to a fierce, practical determination to collect evidence. Ninsara, the researcher, what is this? He anchored his voice to a fact rather than a judgment. Her eyes remained level. It is for the right. She answered. You know the right. He had seen the monarch convulse on the Ziggurat's summit. He had seen the monarch on the throne with ropes and foam. He had seen the monarch jerk awake with bitter herbs shoved between his teeth. Those memories were concrete. The rope abrasions at the wrist, the metallic scrape of symbols, the physician holding a pressed cloth to the temple. He set the protocol on the bench and touched the indent where the ochre had pooled. This is a recipe for seizure, Ninsara. This is medication and theater combined. Who signed this? Ninsara's voice remained quiet. You lack context, researcher. You speak without the proper right view. The people need a god to hold to. Order requires performance. Otherwise the city fractures. Lugal, Kala stepped forward and interrupted, voice hoarse with something like relief and fear. Am I a murderer? He asked. I gave him herbs. I held a compress. I watched him come through it. He lives because of what we do. He is still the king. The researcher watched Lugal. Kala's fingers curl around a brass spoon. Lugal, Kala's jaw worked. The researcher moved his weight so his foot nudged a small clay tablet half, buried beneath a sack. The first external event after the hook arrived when the temple corridor doors banged open and 3 attendants spilled in. The sound forced all of them into action. An attendant lunged for the jar as if to reclaim it. The researcher shoved him back and the tray of vials tipped, sending a thin line of silver liquid across the stone. One attendant shouted, "Seize him!" And Chief Guard Baloo's boots hit the steps with a hard rhythm. The researcher shoved the protocol into his coat, and made for a narrow stair that led to a hatch. A priestly attendant grabbed at his sleeve. He wrenched free and ran, feeling fabric tear, hearing the brass ring of harnesses behind him. He reached the stone-lined corridor outside the apothecary and met Baloo on the stair where the passage narrowed. Baloo's voice was blunt. "You will stop this. Hand over anything you took." The researcher, breathing rough, answered with a single, controlled action. He flung the clay tablet into the brazier set against the wall. Heat flared and the tablet smoked. The guard cursed, a priest struck the bell, and the corridor's acoustic swallowed the noise and amplified panic. The researcher forced himself into a calm, logistical mode. He had sacrificed part of the evidence. He could not allow every fragment to be lost. At dawn, the researcher slipped into the restricted scriptorium with Temple's scribe, Amatu, waiting behind a stack of clay tablets. Amatu's hands were ink-stained and the room smelled of wet clay. He put an unwrapped tablet in front of the researcher and set a reed stylus on the table. "You throw away the fire and leave the ashes, Amatu. You burn the page and expect the script to die too. This one survived because I wrote a copy. I will read aloud if you will listen." Amatu's tone had a patient cadence. He spoke the text, and the researcher's doubt shifted toward cold clarity as sentences named the Council of Ash and outlined rituals timed to civic festivals. "Council of Ash." The researcher, "You saw names. Who signed?" Amatu nodded and tapped the tablet. "Ishara, Ninsara, 2 elders. Protocol approved in secret." The scribe's eyes flicked to the doorway. "They believe a steady God keeps the city obedient. They believe violence disguised as divine violence binds people to a single truth." The researcher felt the emotion shift again, from clarity into alarm. If the council sanctioned the program, exposure could tear the city open, not fix it. The researcher had to choose between publication and the immediate danger of collapse. He did not get to decide calmly. Lugal Kala's confession forced his hand. The researcher found the physician in his low, lit chamber, leaning against a bedroll and rubbing his temple with one sodden cloth. Lugal Kala's face was hollow, cheeks stained by sleeplessness. "You forced me here," Lugal Kala said before the researcher could speak. "You stood at the summit and wrote in the margins of the record. You saw what I do." The researcher produced the protocol, and the physician's resolve crumpled. "Yes," Lugal Kala said, "I dose him. For years I diluted, complicated. The seizures are, most of the time, chemical reactions plus sound and stagecraft. Sometimes they are worse than we expected. Once in the coronation theater, the king did not stop convulsing for an hour. We thought he would die." The researcher listened and wrote in shorthand across the margins of his memory each precise detail. The name of the herb, the pattern of symbol strikes, the placement of a sigil juice under the tongue. Lugal Kala's confession created a bargain. "I will take you to the Hall of Statues on the day of Ascension," he said. "I will show you behind the curtain. But if I am found, they will kill me and burn the house where my mother sleeps." The researcher knew the physician's fear and guilt were leverage. He agreed. They left during the late morning while the city hummed with market traffic beyond the temple walls. The researcher felt empowerment that was clinical. A plan to collect undeniable proof. He kept his tone low. "You sign with me and you will give a witness statement before anyone else can intercept," he said. Lugal Kala nodded. When they brought the partial evidence to Council Elder Ishara, the response was measured dismissal. Ishara sat behind a long table strewn with records and a cup of cooled tea. He looked at the researcher with the air of a man who had seen dangerous accusations before. The researcher presses too fast. "Ishara, we cannot destabilize the people on a rumor. We will investigate with care." The researcher placed the tablet fragments on the table and said, "This is not a rumor. It is a protocol with signatures. I will publish it if you will not act." Ishara's hand tightened around the cup. He slid a sealed note across to a clerk and poised his pen. "If you publish, the city will fracture. You understand what disorder brings. We will not be party to a folly that kills thousands. The researcher paced the council chamber, anger translating into a faster, harder stride. There was a political betrayal in Ishara's caution. The researcher left with a new emotion, isolation, and the conviction to act alone. At dawn the next day, Lugal, Kola led the researcher and Amatu along a secret route. The passage smelled of damp stone and old oil. Moss had started in the corners. Amatu kept a reed lamp in front of them. They crawled beneath statues and through a narrow slit and came into the rear of the Hall of Statues. The priests were chanting when they crept into the shadow of the alcoves. The monarch lay on a raised dais, breathing in a rhythm that was not his own. His eyes opened and closed in an alien cadence, his tongue moving over shapes that did not match the languages the researcher knew. The priests chanted a rote pattern while the monarch shifted and recited names of places he could not possibly know. The researcher felt fear translate into survival instincts. He mouthed to Amatu, "Record this. Note the cadence." Amatu's fingers flew over a waxed tablet. Lugal, Kala swallowed and said, "They will notice us. We must wait for a chance to act." Suddenly a loose boot scraped on stone. A priest had turned and seen movement in the alcove. A headlight of torchlight washed the hidden passage. The researcher held his breath and a silent order passed among them. They would not flee without proof. The external event, detection, forced immediate escalation. At dusk the hall filled for the scheduled ascension. The researcher decided to act. He stepped into the open, and in front of the statues and the assembled crowd, denounced the rite as fakery and staged the mechanics of the ascension by hurling the incriminating tablet into the brazier. He spoke in a measured, archival voice. "You are watching a machine made by men," he said. "This tablet proves design. This is not divine wrath. It is a system." He threw the tablet in. Flames licked the edges. The crowd shuddered, priests shouted, and the monarch convulsed. The monarch's seizure was escalation into something nobody had planned. The body convulsed beyond the patterns the researcher had catalogued. The monarch's limbs lashed and his voice split into guttural syllables not present in any common tongue. A priest shouted, "Seal the doors," and priests stepped back as the monarch's body asked and struck a priest across the chest. Blood spattered against a polished statue. The researcher lunged for the brazier to pull the smoking fragments free, and Amatu reached and seized a charred shard with trembling fingers. The hall turned violent. Priests attempted to restrain the monarch and the entity. Whatever had been invited by the staged ritual lashed outward. Several attendants retreated through the doorway. Chief Priestess Ninsara moved forward, blade raised as if to execute an emergency sacrifice. The researcher shouted, "Stop, Ninsara!" The blade did not fall. Ninsara's expression changed in a visible physical way. Her hand stilled, her jaw tightened, and she looked at the monarch with a calculation that cut through moral fog. "We bind it, or it binds us," she said. A rapid argument broke out between priests and attendants. Voices chopped into short lines. "Ninsara, you staged this." The researcher, "You signed the protocol." The chief priestess answered in quick, clipped words. "You expose us and you destroy the order." "I protect the city, you protect the throne by poisoning a man." Lugal, Kola snapped. "Lugal, Kala, you risk your mother." Ninsara shot back. "Baloo, bind the exits," she ordered. "Baloo, do I have your word?" Baloo's reply was terse. "You have my word. We will hold the line." The hall fractured in a series of short, violent exchanges. 6 rapid lines of dispute passed between Lugal, Kala, Ninsara, Baloo, and a senior priest as the entity in the monarch's body screamed and threw a sconce. The researcher tried to pull the monarch free of the nearest priest's grip. The monarch's eyes opened, and for a beat they were not eyes anyone recognized. They were glassy and riffling. The researcher grabbed the monarch's wrist and felt heat that was wrong for a human body. He tore free as the monarch's fist struck, and a priest dropped a censer, scattering burning incense. Sparks caught in a priest's robe and flames licked. The nearest statue's paint bubbled. A secondary, surprising revelation arrived in the chaos. One of the priestly attendants, a young man the researcher had seen in the apothecary, faltered and then pulled a hidden cord. A fresco panel slid back and revealed a small chamber where dozens of clay jars sat stacked, each labeled and dated. The researcher realized the ritual apparatus was more extensive than any of them had admitted. The reveal changed the researcher's strategy. He no longer believed exposure alone would stop the thing. He needed containment and salvage. He barked orders in the short, numeric fashion he learned when forced into haste. Amatu, take the shard. Lugal Collar, help me move him from the dais. Baloo, clear an exit and lead survivors out calmly. Ninsara, if you want to stop this, pull the lead sigil from the mouth. Each line got a single action in response. Amatu wrapped the sherd in woven cloth. Lugal Collar gripped the monarch under the arms. Baloo shoved people toward the side door in blunt, efficient pushes. Ninsara moved, and for a breath the hall held suspended as she reached the monarch and pried a wet, blacked token from between his teeth. When the token came free, the monarch's body shuddered and his limbs slackened. Several people fell to their knees, some coughing from smoke, some holding wounds. The researcher saw Lugal Collar's face collapse into a wet, exhausted relief, and Ninsara's jaw close in a manner that suggested calculation, not remorse. The entity had not been banished. It had been curbed by removing the sigil. The researcher felt a closing emotion, a grim, scholarly dread that this force responded to objects and could be summoned again. In the immediate aftermath, the council moved to cover the damage. Soldiers and clerks in clean robes began sealing doors and removing bodies. Council Elder Ishara returned with a delegation and a sealed letter ordering silence and the removal of the brazious ashes. He stood before the researcher with the same calm mask he had worn in the council chamber and said, "You forced a public disturbance." "We will secure the city," the researcher answered in the only physical language that mattered. He handed Amatu a fragment of charred script and instructed, "Record every name. Copy into wax. Hide them in the archive north of the river with my seal." Amatu nodded and began copying. The council's program did not end that night. It shifted. Ishara issued decrees that reconstituted authority in the temple's favor. Ninsara and her inner circle retained ritual privileges but lost direct contact with the monarch. Lugal Collar was put under guard but called to provide medical records. The researcher saw the pattern of institutional damage control. Public order maintained, while the mechanisms of control were privatized. He also realized that the entity had become, in some measure, autonomous. Needlework alone could not stitch it back into the fabric of the city's beliefs. It had teeth. The researcher and Amatu escaped the ruined hall with scorched fragments and a single small brass pendant bearing a sigil. They moved through riverbank alleys where night had thickened into an economic hush. Fishmongers slept with a net over their wares. They took a boat and crossed the river by a little, used barge and arrived at a hidden scriptorium with the door bolted and the lamp already lit by a junior archivist who had been briefed. The researcher laid the fragments on the table. He ordered them catalogued, described and copied. Amatu worked quickly, hammering out exact transliterations. "Ishara will smother this, Amatu, between reed strokes. He will bury it under civic needs." The researcher answered by doing what scholars do. He made a cold decision to preserve proof rather than publish it. He stitched the evidence into two systems. The first was a private archive sealed with an improbable number of locks and a coded register kept in 3 places. The second was a network of discreet scribes and sympathetic merchants who would disperse copies slowly, under hard conditions, to places beyond the city's immediate control. He knew running the evidence into public view now would topple institutions and risk mass violence. He also knew letting the pattern of staged possession continue unopposed would perpetuate the horror. The researcher chose containment by slow diffusion, a strategy meant to force the council into changes over decades rather than days. Lugal Kala's personal arc closed in a quiet, specific way. The physician confessed in a private note to the researcher, placing on record the exact compounds and timings he had used and confessing that once he had crossed a line and given a greater dose than necessary, which had nearly killed the monarch. He, the researcher, to ensure the care of his sister should anything come to pass. The researcher arranged the sister a safe passage out of the city and placed the physician under the protection of a medic guild in a neighboring town on the condition he never returned to the temple. Lugal Kala left with his guilt documented and with small, concrete relief, his mother and sister alive. Ninsara did not die, and the researcher did not see her publicly punished. Instead, she was removed from direct oversight and sent to an outer temple for penance rituals that included supervised labor and public confession of procedural missteps. The council allowed her a quiet reprieve that left her intact as a person with power and with a wary, unreadable look. Amatu recorded her name in the register and repeated it aloud for clarity so future readers might track responsibility. The researcher watched Ninsara walk away and felt no surge of triumph. He catalogued her actions for future accountability. The researcher wrote his final report in the hidden scriptorium while rain tapped the roof in a steady, non-poetic rhythm. His notes were concrete. Dates, signatures, vials, the precise wording of the Ascension Protocol, the list of jars discovered behind the fresco, the testimony of Lugal Kala, and the charred remnants recovered from the brazier. He included a line-by-line replication of the chant cadence recorded by Amatu and transcribed the monarch's foreign syllables. His tone was scholarly and spare. He bound the report in leather, affixed a brass seal, and placed the brass pendant inside the binding. At night the researcher sat by the table and read his own hand. He felt a final shift from desperate action to a solemn, exact dread. He prepared a distribution schedule and sealed 3 copies. He instructed Amatu to memorize a set of names and routes and to leave for the eastern trade towns on the 3rd day. Amatu, ink, stained finger steady, accepted the sack with the copied tablets. We move it slowly. Amatu, we must not inflame the city. We must be wiser than those who use terror for power. The researcher nodded and tightened the strap on his bag. The last concrete event of the chapter came when a courier arrived at the scriptorium with a sealed missive from the council. The researcher opened it in the lamp's light and read the content. An order that archived the affair under the category of state security and forbade any unauthorized dissemination. Ishara's signature sat at the bottom. The envelope's seal had been stamped with an older ring, not the current council mark, but a private signet used by a number of elders. The researcher folded the letter and placed it under the final archive lock. He closed the leather binding and set the brass pendant on top of the stack. Amatu escorted the copy safely to the boat at dawn. Lugal Kala left the city with his sister for the medic guild. Ninsara was marched to the outer temple with a handful of attendants. The council repaired the damages and repaired public narratives. They blamed illicit ritual fanatics for the violence rather than institutional sanctions. The researcher stayed behind to do the work scholars do when evidence is dangerous. He labeled, he cross-referenced, he placed duplicates in false bindings and sent one to a trusted merchant who would ship it to an artisan across the desert. He felt a persistent, practical dread every time another copy left his hands, because each copy increased the chance of discovery, but also increased the odds someone far away could act without the council's reach. He preferred that trade-off. When the final lock clicked into place, the researcher laid his palm on the leather and let 2 breaths run through him. He had preserved proof. He had secured lives. He had not stopped the presence from existing in a fuller sense. The monarch was alive, altered, and the token had been removed. The council had saved the city by reasserting order. Lugal Kala would live in exile. Ninsara would retain ritual influence in an attenuated form. Amatu would carry fragments of truth across borders. The researcher had done the only thing available to a scholar working inside a system. He had recorded, preserved, and distributed knowledge carefully enough that later generations might use it. He tied the last seal and heard a soft scrape at the outer door as someone, a junior archivist returning from a watch, set a ledger inside the threshold. The researcher lifted the lid, took the ledger, and wrote one final entry: names, dates, actions taken, and where fragments were hidden. He closed the lid, locked it, and slid the key into a pocket. The chapter ends with the researcher standing at the desk, the brass pendant warm in his palm, and the sealed council missive folded beneath the archive's lock as a concrete sign that the city's guardians would continue to mend their network in silence.